Hey all you cats and kittens. Guess what? It's Fungal Friday. And my name is Lyndzee Ryan, and I'm here to talk to you today about mushrooms and how they are the unsung heroes of the world. But first, a little business. We are currently closed to the public, but staff can still be seen on site occasionally for animal care and online program production. Also, this is likely going to be one of our last live presentations. We're going to be focusing our efforts more on bringing you better quality and engaging content. So stay tuned for some more really amazing posts. To start us off, I want you to become budding mycologists by the end of this presentation, and that means we're going to go over the basics of things first. We're going to cover how mushrooms are going to save the world, then we're going to cover some common backyard species that you might find, and, quote, how to get rid of them. So let's start out with the basics. There are several things underneath basics that three things that we're gonna cover under the basics section. And the first one is what exactly is a mushroom, the different kinds of mushrooms that can be found, and their role in an ecosystem. And currently there are 1.5 million known species of fungi in the world. And in Kansas alone, there are 750 plus species, and scientists speculate that we've really only identified about 10% of all the species on Earth. So what is a mushroom exactly? So we all know the 5 major kingdoms. The kingdom of protists, the kingdom of Manarians, the kingdom of animals, and the kingdom of plants are the 2 big ones though. So where are the mushrooms? Because I don't see them in plants or animals, and that's because it's neither of those. Actually, mushrooms are more closely related to human beings than they are to plants. Like some animals, specifically arthropods, they have cells with glycogen and chitin, which gives them their stiff cell walls. Plants have cellulose, and mushrooms do not. They lack chlorophyll, and they're heterotrophic, they're terrestrial, and they're multicellular. So because they're just such weird little oddballs, they get their kingdom all to themselves. They don't fall under plants, they don't fall under animals, they get a kingdom all by themselves. Now keep in mind that this kingdom of fungi covers everything from mushrooms that you can see like out on the ground or on a tree to molds and mildews and yeast and plant pathogens and smuts and rusts and parasitic ones, and it's a whole big group of organisms. So we're going to take just a little bit to go over the different forms or the different kinds of mushrooms that can actually be found here in Kansas, and all of these upcoming photos I took in Kansas. Okay, so this is a lovely guild mushroom. Here's the beginnings of one of those, of a nice large puffball. Here are some inky caps. Another little grouping of puffballs. This one is actually a parasitic fungi that's growing on an exposed root of one of the trees that's in Chisholm Creek Park. And that tree is not in very good shape anymore. And that's because this fungi is actually absorbing a lot of resources that tree needs itself. And it's basically sucking the life out of that tree. These are one of my absolute favorite kinds of mushrooms. They're a jelly fungi, so when you poke them, they feel a lot like Jello. They're probably one of my favorite groups, and one of my favorite things about them is that when it gets too hot and dry out, they just kind of shrivel up and get all crunchy, but as soon as it rains, they reconstitute and they become this lovely gelatinous texture all over again. But they're not wet or slimy, they're just jiggly like Jello. Here are a couple of other puffballs. These ones are actually really small, probably about the size of a nickel, and they're covered in these lovely white spines that you can see. Here's another one of my favorites. I'm just going to clear the air now. All of these are my favorite, but some of these I get more excited about than others, and this is one of those species that I get really excited about. These are bird nest fungi, and they're so tiny. Like you can see, the substrate that they're attached to, those are wood chips, and they're smaller than your average sized wood chips. So these guys are microscopic little things, and they can be really difficult to find. But what they do is they have that little cup right there, and inside they have eggs, and those eggs are actually full of all these spores that the mushrooms use to reproduce. So when it rains, a raindrop will fall and hit the side of that cup and spill those eggs out, and they get launched a really long distance, and then they'll land on something, they'll dry out, and then burst open and release all of those spores. So it's a really fascinating species, and there are several that fall into this grouping. Bird nest fungi is just one of the common names that it has. These are some cute little guys. This is a stinkhorn. Many of you might be familiar with this kind. They usually pop up in your lawn or in your wood chips after a good rain, and they usually smell pretty bad. And that's because this brown slime that you see on the top of it is really good at attracting insects, specifically flies. So when a fly lands on this mushroom, it will gobble up that stinky, slimy material, and it's actually packed full of spores. So then that fly will go somewhere else and drop those spores off, and then that mushroom can germinate, so to speak, and grow into a whole new fungi. It's really fascinating. Here's a Earth Star puffball, also one of my favorites. Here's a Ganoderma. These are really common. They grow on the sides of rotting wood, usually found on logs, or you can find them on trees. They're all over the place. They're really common. Here's another little guy. I'm not even 100% sure about what this species is. I've been having a difficult time trying to key it out. All I know is that it's really cute. Here's a coral fungi. And last but certainly not least, they can be used as tiny umbrellas. So continuing on with our basics, we need to talk about really what that mushroom is and its role in an ecosystem. Now, when people think of a mushroom, they think of the part that they can see above ground. And that's not the only part. The mushroom itself is just the reproductive portion of a whole bigger organism, and that bigger organism is hiding underneath or in the substrate that it's feeding on. So most people like to compare mushrooms to a tree, and I don't really like that analogy, and here's why. It's because if you cut a tree off at the base of its trunk, you're left with a stump, and then that tree dies, right? But if you cut a mushroom off, you're not killing the whole organism. The rest of it is safe underground and in that substrate, keeping it nice and toasty or safe. So instead of using a tree as an analogy, I like to use it more like an iceberg. You can only see one tiny part of it. Even if that part gets broken off, the rest of it remains safe underneath the water or underneath the soil or inside the tree that it's decomposing. Now, another way to describe a mushroom is like an apple to a tree, not the tree itself. The apple has seeds in it, and the mushroom has spores. The seeds of the apple help that tree reproduce, or it's their mode of reproduction. And the mushroom has the spores, which is the mode of reproduction for that fungi. Now, if you pick an apple, the rest of the tree is okay. Just like if you pick a mushroom, the rest of the fungus is going to be okay. So what roles are these mushrooms playing in an ecosystem? Well, there are three main ones. The first one is saprobic, and that means that they are breaking down organic, decaying matter that is present in an environment, and that includes dead or dying trees. It includes straw or wood chips or dead animals or poop, all kinds of stuff. So this little guy who's coming out of this wood chip right here, that mycelium is just packed all up inside that teeny tiny wood chip. And if you look close enough, you can see a little white dot right here, and that's the beginning of another one of these amazing mushrooms. And that just kind of gives you an idea of the scale that we're dealing with. They can be really, really tiny, or they can be really big. So the next role that they play in an ecosystem is called mycorrhizal, and that's where they have this amazing symbiotic relationship with the plants and trees root systems. And you can see in this picture that the mushroom and the tree are shaking hands, which kind of gives you an idea of the kind of relationship that they have. Now, this mushroom, the underground part of it, is actually called a mycelium. And that mycelium is made up of a bunch of different pieces called hyphae. And those hyphae are smaller than tree root hairs, so they're better at absorbing water and nutrients than that tree would be able to get on its own. So this relationship involves that mushroom giving that tree or that plant water and nutrients it couldn't get on its own. And that tree in return gives it sugars and other carbohydrates that mushroom would normally get if it was, say, being saprobic and digesting like decaying organic matter in the environment. So they have this really fascinating relationship with each other. And there's been a lot of recent studies done where the mycelium that's connected to one tree is actually connected to other trees around it, thus connecting those trees to each other. It's really crazy stuff. And if you haven't looked into it yet, I highly encourage you. It's mind-blowing. Okay, the last major role that they play in an ecosystem is parasitic. And most of you probably have a general understanding of what this is based on BBC videos, or they can even be parasitic on humans, like ringworm or like a toe fungus, which is gross. But my favorite kind of parasitic fungi is the one that infects insects, and it plays a really important ecological role because it helps control insect populations and it gives other animals something to eat. So it helps those critters stay healthy and it helps maintain a healthy ecosystem. So I know what you're all here for. You're here to learn how mushrooms are going to save the world. So let's talk about exactly how they're going to do that. And there are 5 big ways that I'm going to mention today. And to start us off, I just want to mention that mushrooms are a severely overlooked resource. Research into the many applications that mushrooms have is just now catching momentum. From food sources to industrial material, from medicine, they can filter water. Mushrooms are really dynamic and they're really unique. And thanks to their rapid growth and reproduction, it makes them perfect for sustainability. And harnessing the power of these organisms can literally change landscapes, daily lives, health, and basically the whole world. So the first one is that they can heal the environment. This mycelium that I've been mentioning, that's the bigger organism that mushroom is attached to or reproducing for. That mycelium is basically like a soil magician. Mushrooms can help rebuild after natural disasters. They've been tested to filter chemicals and pathogens out of water systems that supply drinking water, especially during disaster relief issues. There's habitat restoration, and it's enhanced by rapid reproduction and cell growth, as well as slowing soil erosion and offering multi-directional transfer of nutrients among the plants, just like that mycorrhizal relationship that we just talked about. Now, mushrooms can even break down human waste into something that is considered valuable, like more mushrooms. So, Cheeto Govera, I hope I'm pronouncing her name right, is a young Zimbabwean entrepreneur who once said that waste is only waste when it's wasted, and that resonates with me so much. Now, as these mushrooms are breaking down this waste, fermentation actually allows the waste to be broken down even faster into sugars that can be made into like bioplastic blends and polyester. And these bioplastics and polyesters are actually eco-friendly materials that can be used to make products similar to like plastic bags and latex gloves. It doesn't matter where that mushroom plastic ends up, either in landfills or in the ocean or wherever, because it's organic and it's bio-healthy. It actually breaks down in the environment, unlike plastic does, and it only puts harmless organic matter back into the environment, which is amazing. So not only can these mushrooms prevent the environment from being polluted in the first place, but they can also help clean that pollution if it's already present. Now, like I mentioned, mushrooms can break down human waste, and it's really fascinating stuff because people can take these mushrooms and grow them in a certain material and turn them into different plastics, like these crates right here, and even in packaging materials. I know that there are some restaurants out there now who are starting to move away from styrofoam packaging to-go products and putting them in like mushroom cultivated packaging because it's more eco-friendly. So there is a project out there that has successfully produced plastic consuming mushrooms, and this ties back in with how they can clean up pollution that's already in the environment. Now, these mushrooms can break down and, quote, eat the plastic. Now, what I mean by eat is mushrooms don't have a digestive system the way that humans or other animals do. They have to excrete digestive enzymes, and they break down those materials, and then they can absorb what's left over after they've been broken down into more easily managed the there isn't a whole lot of research out there yet, and there definitely needs to be some that's done to determine if it's safe for humans to eat the mushrooms that are breaking down these plastics. But either way, it's really promising to know that there's a natural organism out there that can start munching away at the huge piles of plastic waste that's just covering our planet. Mushrooms also have the capability to filter contaminated soil and water, and I mentioned that briefly before. But what's really interesting is that one species of mushroom, they're called Ostreatus pleurotus. Sorry, it's a Friday, reverse those. Pleurotus ostreatus has been documented to actually clean up oil spills by digesting those organic compounds and absorbing them into their own fungal bodies. But they can also absorb like toxic waste found in the soil. And these fungi break down and feed nutrients to plants and can even be used as an alternative to dangerous pesticides for crops. And there's a lot of interesting research out there about it. For instance, one scientist has kind of crossbred these really interesting parasitic fungi that target pest insects in the agricultural world. If you haven't read Paul Stamets' book, Mycelium Running, I highly recommend it. It's fascinating. So the number 2 is that they can provide sustainable materials. Now, using mushrooms to create environmentally friendly everyday products can help reduce the amount of pollution. And I've already touched on a couple of those. But not only can it reduce the amount of pollution, but it can also reduce cost and time and effort in producing those materials. A startup company called MycoWorks, and I can't remember exactly where they're based out of right now, but they produce raw materials out of fungus. They grow mushroom bricks that have been tested to be stronger than concrete. They're fire retardant and they're really lightweight. They can grow leather like mushroom hide in just a few weeks. And I have a short clip I'm going to play for you here in a second. In comparison, it literally takes years to grow the same amount of leather on a cow, not to mention like having to butcher the cow and having to water it and feed it for so many years. So there's a eco-friendly alternative to leather. They've also even grown furniture out of these mushrooms. They have produced stuff like shoes and light fixtures and purses and even electronics that have been built with mushroom materials, which is just fascinating. And many of these mushrooms can be grown using agricultural waste, such as corn cobs and hemp husks and rice hulls and like paper pulp waste and coffee grounds and sawdust. And there are so many different substrates that these mushrooms will consume that the possibilities are literally endless, and they're so easy to come by, and it's a cheap resource, and mushrooms grow really easily. Now, that waste can then become alternatives to wood and brick and plastic and leather in the span of a couple of weeks rather than years. And the materials can be made to be breathable and moisture wicking, and they can float, and they're fireproof, and they're naturally antibacterial. So I'm going to play this quick video of him describing this mushroom leather, okay?
This strange background behind me
oh dear, I clicked off of something.
is actually the hide or the skin of a type of mushroom, Ganoderma lucidum. This is a traditional type of fungus that has been used in medicine in Asia for millennia that we grew at MycoWorks. And this behaves and acts a lot like animal skin. So this is really the starting point, is imagining it as leather. This takes 2 weeks. It's crazy. The mushrooms grow at an exponential rate. So it's more how fast can we keep up with the organism.
By comparison, a piece of cowhide the same size takes 2 years to grow.
And that takes a lot of resources and a lot of food and a lot of time to create that animal for our use.
Yeah, so there you have it. Mushrooms are clearly the obvious choice here. But here are I think I have a couple images of some of the products that have been made from this mushroom leather. And bags, again, like shoes, hats. There are so many different possibilities. I briefly mentioned that they're being used in electronics. So there is a potential that your laptop or your phone or our solar panels could be made out of a fungus in the future. Who knows? So let's go on to our third reason why they're going to save the world. And that's because they're actually going to help feed the world. Now, most edible mushrooms are a really healthy choice. They're low in carbohydrates, low in calories, low fat, sodium, and sugar, but they're really high in stuff like antioxidants and B vitamins and copper and selenium and all kinds of good stuff. Mushrooms are actually one of the only non-fortified food sources of vitamin D, and the only source of vitamin D that can be found in the produce aisle, which is, I think, pretty significant. Now, do you remember that entrepreneur that I mentioned a little bit ago? Well, she has a really interesting story. Again, her name is Cheeto Govera. I really hope I'm pronouncing that right. But I'm going to tell you a short story about her and how mushrooms literally changed her life. So she was orphaned at the age of 8 and left to care for her 5-year-old brother and her almost 100-year-old grandmother by herself. She was abused and hungry and nearly sold as a child bride until she took a one-day class that taught her how to grow and harvest mushrooms. That discovery, the discovery that she could have a plate full of mushrooms to herself and provide food for her family, was an entire revelation that led her to starting her own business that helps teach local villagers how to grow their own mushrooms and helps provide food for those hungry villagers. She learned that she could not only solve hunger problems for her immediate family, but as a whole community. And she started this business to hopefully share that knowledge with surrounding people in her village. And beyond that, for instance, the rapid growth and the sustainability of these amazing organisms can feed hungry families and communities almost indefinitely. There are species out there that taste like lobster, and some that have no taste and they really only serve for a good texture, or some that can take on the taste of whatever it is that they're being cooked in. There are so many different tastes and textures to experience. They're going to save the world, and that's that. The fourth way that they're going to help save the world is they help stop the spread of diseases. We're all really familiar with penicillin, and I'll touch on that here in just a quick second. But because of the overuse of antibiotics and harmful diseases that are becoming resistant to common drugs that are used to treat them, mushrooms are actually being used to develop treatments against those drug-resistant bacteria, and there's a lot of science out there right now about how fungi can help prevent the spread of those diseases. Now, penicillin is one of the world's most potent and well-known antibiotics, and it's literally made from a bread mold. Bread mold. The stuff that is probably growing in your kitchen, or at least I've found it growing in mine at some point. I don't know. I love bread, so I try not to let it go bad. There's even research being done right now about the benefits of psychoactive species and the positive effects that it has in regards to mental health. So that's something to keep in mind too. And the last way that they are going to help save the world is that they help provide a better understanding of our world. You remember that mycelium, the actual body of the fungus and not the mushroom itself? Well, it has this ability to form really intricate web structures underneath the soil that allows for both mutual and parasitic relationships. And remember that mycorrhizal relationship that we talked about where the trees and the fungi benefit? Well, all of it is really vital to the environment. And that mycelium actually has the ability to go inside of the tree roots itself, or it can kind of encapsulate it on the outside. And this as I mentioned, these mushrooms absorb sugars, and the plants produce those sugars through photosynthesis, and that mushroom helps give it nutrients and moisture that it wouldn't be able to get from the soil. Now, most plants in the terrestrial environment are dependent upon fungi relationships for survival and prosperity, meaning that our forests are a lot more dependent on fungi than has ever been realized. You can't take a step outside without walking over some kind of mycelium. It's everywhere, and it's this huge underground network that really nobody's aware of. Now, these parasitic relationships, again, help create necessary habitats for important bugs and insects. So if there's a parasitic fungi on a tree, like I mentioned earlier, that one that was attached to that root and the tree isn't doing so well, that one actually helps create habitats for other animals. For instance, screech owls who can live in or who make their nests inside tree hollows, or it helps woodpeckers find food because insects move in there, and it creates this whole other habitat. Even though the tree is dying, it's important for that ecosystem. Ultimately, these relationships help create more food for smaller animals and like rodents and insects. Another important fungal forest function, that's a lot of F's, is its role as a natural nutrient recycler. These fungi that feed on dead matter, remember those saprobic ones, those ones that are breaking down dead or dying trees, poop, dead animals, all kinds of stuff, they return what they have eaten as nutrients into the soil for plants to be able to use later. So without the fungi, the forest ground would be infested with layers of needles, leaves. I mean, we'd be up to our eyeballs in poop. They're doing us a huge favor. And they're not even doing us a favor. They're just doing what they do in the ecosystem. Now, these areas obviously need way more study. I mean, most mycologists right now are studying the benefits that mushrooms can give to the medical community, or how they can help us clean up our messes. But there also need to be scientists out there studying these mushrooms in their environment and the species themselves. And if you're watching this, go study some mushrooms, and we'll talk. So now that we understand how mushrooms are going to save the world, let's talk about some that you might already be familiar with, or ones that might pop up in your yard that you're just going to start noticing for the first time. That first one is called Agaricus campestris, and its common name is the meadow mushroom. And these guys grow in the lawns in springtime after a good rain. They're not very big. These guys are actually the cousin to the white button mushrooms that you find in grocery stores, which means that it is an edible species. The problem is that there are two species that look almost identical to these guys, except for really minor qualities. So I don't advise trying to find these and consume them unless you really know what you're looking at and you have a second opinion to back up what you think that species is. Anyway, the key things to note about this species is that the gills are crowded really, really close together. And when they're young, those gills start out as a lovely pink color, but as they get older, they turn to this delicious looking dark chocolate brown color. But I know I use the word delicious there, but again, keep in mind that if you don't know your mushrooms, don't. It's not worth it. They can be found growing in fairy rings, and there's another species that grows in lawns and ditches and wide open spaces that also grows in fairy rings, and this one's called Chlorophylla molybdites, and it has several common names, and those include the vomiter, the false parasol, or the green-spored lepiota. And some of you might be like, why is it called a lepiota? I don't even know what a lepiota is. Well, a lepiota is a genus of mushrooms, and Chlorophylla molybdites used to be a lepiota, but it's no longer considered that. So it still retains that old common name. Now, the reason it has the nickname the vomiter is because it actually causes the most poisonings in North America, and that's because it's often confused with our friend here, the meadow mushroom. So that's one to keep in mind. The big difference here is that these are gigantic mushrooms, and some of you might be familiar with these because you've seen them growing in your yard or in a ditch as you're driving home or wherever. And they're massive. Their stems can be upwards of 20 centimeters long. Their caps can be 22 centimeters across. I mean, the biggest one I've seen is probably about that big. I mean, they're huge. And the big difference between this mushroom and this one that I showed you is that this one has white gills when it's young, and then when it gets older, they take on this green color, which is why it's called the green-spored lepiota, because it has green spores. It's really cool. And spores of these mushrooms can be all kinds of different colors. I've seen pink and purple and the green ones, and I mean, they're all over the color spectrum. Another one that is really common, and these guys, these Chlorophylla molybdites, grow in the summer months. The meadow mushroom grows in the springtime. And here's another one that also starts coming out in the springtime. I've seen it in the springtime, let me rephrase that, but it's more likely to be found in the summer and the fall. So this is the Coprinus commodus, which is the shaggy mane or the lawyer's wig, and you might be able to figure out why it has that common name. These guys are covered in scales, and they actually belong to a group called inky caps, and that's because they do this really fascinating way of distributing their spores, and it's called deliquescing, and that's where they literally digest their own cap and they ooze out this lovely black inky liquid, and that liquid has actually been used hundreds of years ago as an ink or as a rudimentary kind of ink. It's amazing. And these spores are just getting dripped on the ground, and they can kind of smell bad, so they tend to bring in insects a lot. These are the ones, not these ones specifically, but the inky caps are the ones that will pop up in your yard one day and then be gone the next and look like this black, goopy, desiccated pile of goo. And that's what they are. They're inky caps, and they're short-lived, but man, are they cool to find. Another common one is the genus Phallus, and I included an entire genus in this because they all have the same common name, and that's the stinkhorns. And I briefly touched on these earlier. They pop up in your yard after a good rain. They can be found from spring to fall. I wouldn't be surprised if some people are already seeing these. I know it's been a little chilly these last couple of evenings, but don't let that deter your mushroom hunts. Now these, I'm going to repeat this for those of you who are joining us now. These mushrooms have this sticky, really, really stinky slime at the top of their caps, and that is what attracts insects to them. Those insects eat that slime up, and then they also pick up spores from that mushroom. They carry those spores away, they land on something else, and then they can grow into a whole new fungal mycelium. It's almost like a pollinator for a plant. Like, that's what this is for flies and the mushroom. Another really common one I get a lot of questions about are the turkey tails or the false turkey tails. And these are two completely different kinds of mushrooms, though they look really, really similar. Now, this one on the bottom here with all these lovely red colors is a false turkey tail. And you can tell the difference because when you flip them over, you can see that one side is really, really smooth. That's your false turkey tail. And the true turkey tail, that Tramys versicolor, it has a porous surface on the underside of it. So it's actually a true turkey tail, so to speak, and these are your false ones, but they both grow in the same environments at the same time. They both show colorful zones. They can fuse together. I mean, there are all kinds of things. So the big difference between telling these guys apart is flipping them over. The false turkey tail has a smooth underside, and the true turkey tail has the porous undersurface. Another one that is probably one of my absolute favorites to find are oyster mushrooms. These are the ones that I briefly mentioned earlier about being able to absorb oil and break that down and hopefully help us control our oil spills in the future. And fingers crossed that there aren't any major ones. These grow in shelf-like clusters. Their common name is the oyster mushroom, and they get that because they look like oysters on a half shell. And they're absolutely beautiful. Now, there are some that they can be confused for. Just know that these gills run down the mushroom, and they don't have a true stem that they're attached to. They might have like a little offshoot, like a sideways stem, but there isn't one that's just like in the center of it like the mushroom with the cap does. And these guys always have gills that run all the way down that stem, okay? And these are an edible species. They're really, really delicious. I would advise not eating them in the spring, summer, or fall because they get just full of insects, and these insects will lay their eggs in the mushrooms, and then they've got larvae in them, and they're really hard to clean out. But in the winter months, if you get a random, lovely, warm winter day, they've been known to fruit in the wintertime, and that's the best time to get them. So let's talk about benefits of mushrooms in your yard, because I get asked all the time, like, how do I get rid of these mushrooms? And I'm worried about my dog or a child eating them. And those are really valid concerns because there are mushrooms out there that can make you pretty violently ill or even make you die, so to speak. Not so to speak, but words are hard today. So, you can't get rid of mushrooms in your yard unless you get rid of your entire yard and start over. I mean, I wouldn't advise using fungicide because having mushrooms in your yard is actually evidence of a really healthy yard that you have. For example, if you look closely at these images, this one with mycorrhizal fungi, remember that's the one that has a symbiotic relationship with the plants. This grass is healthier with this relationship compared to the grass over here that doesn't really have that relationship. The best advice I can give with concerns over pets and children putting them in their mouths and eating them is to, one, train your dog not to eat them, or teach the child that it's not safe to put those things in their mouth, or go out and just pick them as you see them. But there's really no surefire way of getting rid of mushrooms in your yard. Plus, it means that you have a really good, healthy yard because they're there breaking down unwanted things like dog poop or sticks in the ground. I mean, all kinds of stuff. So I always advocate for keeping them in your yard, or at least pulling the mushrooms out and disposing of them in a safe place. With that, I don't have a buddy here with me today, so I'm going to see if anybody has any questions, and hopefully I can answer them for you. Okay, so Anna says, what did you call the jelly ones? They're one of my favorites. They're my favorite too, Anna. Those are called the spatula jelly fungi. They come in a bunch of different forms, and those are bright yellow ones. They're Tremella something. I cannot remember the species name for it, but I can send it to you. Thanks, Mike. Dalton says, does he say how long the leather lasts compared to cowhide, and what is the process to make the leather? I watched that whole video, and I can put a link to it on your comment, Dalton. I don't think he really talks about the longevity of it, but from the tests that they've run, it's a really long lasting. Oh, and another thing that he mentioned was that instead of having to stitch pieces of leather together and making it weaker in some spots, or attaching fasteners to like wallets or purses or hats to make them adjustable with size, they can literally grow those fasteners and those seams into that leather to make them more durable, which is really fascinating stuff. So I'll put a link to that video for you, Dalton. Okay, I think that's all of them. Again, thank you guys so much for hanging out with me today. It's Fungal Friday. I know the weather is not that great, but I hope you're social distancing and you're staying healthy, and keep an eye out for all of our other amazing content that we're going to be putting out soon. So hang in there, and I'll talk to you guys soon.